Greetings and welcome to our webinar. My name is Professor Ann Karagosian, and it is my privilege as the director of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA to welcome you to our Zoom-based lecture jointly sponsored with the UCLA Narakhatsi Chair in Armenian Studies. The title of today's lecture and discussion is Women's History Through the Colophons of Medieval Armenian Manuscripts, to be presented by Dr. David Zakarian of the University of Oxford, with discussion by Dr. Rosie Vartyter Aroush. We are looking forward to this lecture, which promises to be a fascinating exploration of the practice of colophon writing in the Armenian tradition. That is, the practice where the scribe writes a commemorative note about the production of the manuscript, and what such colophons reveal about the history of Armenian women during the Middle Ages. I am grateful to Professor Peter Cowie, holder of the UCLA Narakhatsi Chair in Armenian Studies, for coordinating this lecture event for us today. I would also like to acknowledge the co-sponsorship of this event by the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies. We thank all of our partners for their contributions to this event. Professor Cowie will provide formal introductions for our speakers in a moment, but let me note that for those of you who are watching live via the Zoom webinar platform, you have an opportunity to send questions to us by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom portion of your screen and typing in the question. Please be sure to be as specific and succinct as possible in your question, and we will direct as many of the questions as are practical to our speakers at the end of the lecture and discussion. Also, please note that this event is being recorded for future viewing at our Promise Armenian Institute website and YouTube channel. And in the unlikely event that this Zoom webinar drops for any reason, please just connect right back to the same link, as it will put you back into our Zoom session. And now it gives me great pleasure to turn the event over to the coordinator of this lecture, Professor Peter Cowie. Professor Cowie is the Narakhatsi Professor of Armenian Studies at UCLA and has taught at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the University of Chicago, and at Columbia University. His research interests include medieval Armenian history, modern Armenian nationalism, and Armenian film and theater. Professor Cowie is the author of 5 books and the editor of 4 others. A regular contributor to Armenological journals, Professor Cowie has received grants from the National Council on Eurasian and East European Research to investigate post-Soviet publishing in the Republic of Armenia. And as a professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA, Professor Cowie teaches numerous courses in modern Armenian language, Eastern Armenian language, classical Armenian language, literature, drama, and a host of other subjects. So Peter, I'll now turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you, Anne, for your introduction. May I add a word of greeting to today's proceedings on behalf of my colleagues in the program in Armenian language and culture. I'm very pleased to welcome back to UCLA Dr. David Zakarian, who participated in our graduate colloquium in Armenian studies some years back. Dr. Zakarian received his BA in English language and literature in 2005 from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and continued to his MA in the same field, which he completed in 2010. Thereafter, he moved to the University of Oxford, where he undertook the Master of Studies program in Classical Armenian at Pembroke College. Building on that, he advanced to the D.Phil, which he defended in 2015 on the subject of the representation of women in early Christian literature, Armenian texts of the 5th century. In revised and expanded form, this was published last year by Brill in the Armenian Texts and Studies series under the title, Women Too Were Blessed, the Portrayal of Women in early Christian Armenian texts. After graduation, Dr. Zakarian received a 3-year British Academy postdoctoral fellowship to work on the colophons of Armenian manuscripts between 1375 and 1501. The author of a number of articles and book chapters in peer-reviewed publications, he is currently an associate faculty member at the Faculty of Oriental Studies in Oxford. The topic of his lecture today is Women's History Through the Colophons of Medieval Armenian Manuscripts.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and I'm really very glad to be here after 10 years. Yeah, indeed, as Professor Kawi said, I was here as a graduate student a few years ago, and I'm very happy and grateful to be here and to present my research to you. This research stemmed from my British Academy postdoctoral research project. And I'm going to very soon publish it as a monograph. And today I'm going to present one of the chapters that is linked to the representation of women and mentions of women in medieval Armenian colophons. So allow me to share my screen now with you. I hope you can see it now. So, from the early Middle Ages onwards, the practice of colophon writing in the Armenian tradition developed immensely, transforming it into a separate literary genre with its own characteristic features, many of which are truly unique as compared to the colophons in other traditions. The etymology of the Armenian term of colophon, յիշատակարան, provides us with a key to understanding the main function of colophons in the Armenian tradition. The word յիշատակարան, which contains morphemes borrowed from Iranian languages, consists of the noun յիշատակ, memory, memorial, which derives from the verb hishel, to remember, and plus the Parthian suffix of the past participle tak, and the productive suffix of the Iranian origin. So you could see the etymology on your screen here. If we basically define what the word յիշատակարան means, it is a place of memory, in other words, or a place of commemoration or memorial, which suggests that the part of the manuscript in which the colophon was inserted was specifically conceived as a space where commemorative notes mentioning certain people, both women and men, religious and lay, and events worthy of commemorations were created and preserved. The basic structure of an Armenian colophon is, it has a specific structure which developed from the 10th century, and you could see it on the screen, that normally you would start with a doxology or a glory, the park bit, and doxology, glory to God and the Holy Trinity. Usually in a variety of ways, the scribe would also present the date of production, the place of production, sponsor's name, religious, political authorities would be there as well. The scribe's name normally would appear, and of course the historical material which makes these colophons unique is one thing that I was researching a lot. And of course, at the end of the manuscript, at the end of the colophon, you would normally have the remember part. So this is kind of the ideal structure of a colophon, but there were some, of course, varieties. And in some colophons, which I researched as well, and I'm going to speak about this on a different occasion, we have a lot of curses and blessings as well included. And that's something that might or might not appear in a normal colophon. To demonstrate some examples, this one is taken from the Bodleian Marsh manuscript 438. It is a Haismavurk, and as you could see, the colophon is at the end of the manuscript, so it's on folio 590. And at the top, you see in the red letters the word park, which is the glory part, and then you have the entire text. And this is the peculiar thing of Armenian colophons, that That was a specific space, and the scribes knew that they need to use it wisely and provide some information. And very often this information is unique because these are people who lived in a specific area, and they try to write about their daily life, about things that happened to them, to their monastery, or in general, things that they heard. And in that sense, the colophons are unique sources of information about the daily life of Armenian people and the communities around them in the Middle Ages. Of course, not all colophons appeared at the end. Sometimes the position might change. And alongside with the colophons, we also have many small commemorative notes. And one such note, one of my favorite ones, is found in this gospel manuscript. As you could see in this image, there is a writing there. If we zoom in, we will see that the illuminator of the manuscript asks the readers to remember him, Makartich, who himself calls as an worthless, unworthy illuminator, Zanarjanes Starkoas. And then he also asks readers to remember the person who bound the manuscript. And at the end, as you could see, the final bit of the formula, as says, basically saying that if you remember me in God, God will also remember you. So there are lots of different types of varieties of colophons and texts. Some of them are formulaic, like standard expressions. The only thing that changes are the dates, the names, and so on. But there are some unique ones. And I will try to demonstrate today a few such unique examples in which we can learn about how women lived in medieval Armenia, what access they had to a variety of things. The only thing that we need to bear in mind is that most of these colophons, not all of them, but most of these colophons were written by men, and they were clerics. So it is their perspective and it is their view on how women acted in society, what they did, and so on. So we need to always bear this in mind. The dominant theme that emerges in the colophons of Armenian manuscripts is the passionate and repeated plea from the scribes, urging their readers to remember in their virtuous prayers a number of people, both living and dead, as you could see from that, from the example on your screen. The list, often quite a long one, usually includes the names of not only the scribes themselves, but also of the members of their extended family, of the sponsors of the manuscript, their kin, of their colleagues, of people who in one way or another assisted them in their work, and so on. Thus, the colophons served as a means for the scribes to perpetuate the memory of people whom they and the sponsors held dear, and to share their genuine appreciation for the support they received. The colophons also became a sort of prosopographical archive, which often allows us to reconstruct parts of family trees and networks of people within a community and beyond. And to make it clear, this remember thing was believed that people, if you remember them in prayer, they have more chances of salvation on the doomsday, on the judgment day. And this is why they urgently asked every reader to remember. And the stress was always on virtuous prayer. So remember them in your virtuous prayers. So a large number of colophons contain commemorations of women. And this paper will discuss such mentions of women in the colophons and explore the colophons' significance as primary sources for women's history and potentially for gender history as well. Most commonly, women are remembered in the colophons owing to their belonging to the nearest circle of the scribe or the sponsor of the manuscript, like their mothers, wives, sisters, sisters-in-law often are mentioned, aunties are mentioned. However, there are also numerous colophons that remember women who sponsored manuscripts or performed remarkable deeds that were considered worthy of remembrance. Albeit very few in numbers, we also possess some colophons composed by women themselves. Now, to demonstrate the significance of colophons for the study of women's life in medieval Armenia, I shall discuss 5 colophons, which were composed between 12th and 15th century. The first colophon that I would like to discuss is the colophon of the Gospel of Sassoun, which was composed in the 12th century. The colophon itself was copied by the 19th century Armenian scholar Garagin Servantsian in 1879 from the original manuscript, which was lost during the Armenian genocide. A second virtually identical copy of the same colophon was preserved in the 17th century Jerusalem manuscript 725. It is relatively a long, lengthy colophon of several pages, written by the scribe Aristakes in the monastery of the Holy Savior near Sassoun. Aristakes follows a standard structure of an Armenian colophon with a glory to God part, then historical section, then the plea for remembrance. And what interests us here is the historical section, which provides details about the sponsor, the circumstances of the creation of the manuscript, and any other detail that the scribe considered worthy of including. And here you could see on your screen the beginning of that colophon, which contains 2 glory parts, which is a bit unusual, but not uncommon. And we already see that the name of the person to whom the gospel was dedicated, Gata, is already inscribed in it. But this is a typical text that you would find in some in colophons. Now, from the perspective of women's history, this colophon allows us to catch a glimpse of life of noble women in the 12th century. According to the scribe, the manuscript was sponsored by Queen Melekset in memory of her daughter, Gata, who passed away during the labor while giving birth to twins. Melekset is presented as, I quote, from the Artsruni family and from the line of Saint Vartan, end of quote. So Vartan referring to Vartan Mamikonian, of course. And she's referred to as the queen throughout the colophon. Queen like Taguhi, the Armenian word that is used by the scribe is Taguhi. Her husband, Vigen, or in the other version, Vegen, did not have any royal blood and was presented as the Lord of Sassoun, the great Patouelesimos, which is the rendering of the Greek word proto-nobelissimos, a title conferred on supreme military commanders by the Byzantines from the 12th century onwards. A question may arise here: why does the scribe call Melekset queen? Is it ascribed to her owing to her royal Artsruni heritage, which is possible, even though the Artsrunis had long lost their authority and power in the neighboring Vaspurakan? Interestingly, Gata, their daughter, is also referred to as the queen after her marriage to Shahenshah, the son of Grigor, the grandson of Katakalos, as the scribe calls him, son of Kamen the Great. Gata's husband's family seems to have had Byzantine roots, but again, no links to royalties. There could be 2 explanations for the use of the title of the queen. The Takuhi substituted or was interchangeably used with the word Digin, an honorary title which was used to refer to both the queen and the lady or the great lady of the clan. On the other hand, Takui literally means a woman who wears a crown, as like the feminine version of Takabor, the king, the one who wears the crown. And it is not unreasonable to assume that the most high-ranking woman in a noble family wore a crown or a tiara or something similar. Nevertheless, when describing Melekset, the scribe does not mention any crown on her head. But as we shall see below, only pearls braided into her hair are visible. So the word Takui most likely was used as an honorary title for the lady of the household, and it didn't refer to any sort of political significance. Melekset in general is presented as a very powerful landlady who must have sponsored the manuscript with her own money. because only she is mentioned as its sponsor. For the scribe, Melchizedek's authority stems from three sources: her ancestry, her marriage, and her devotion to God. So she's described as someone who pursued all virtues, decorating not only her golden locks entwined with pearls and precious gems, or her clothes laced with gold, the source of pride for the minds of royal women, but alongside her bodily greatness, she was also endowed with spiritual virtue, holiness, modesty, humility, the purity of fasting, and the daily prayer. She was the decorator of churches and the protector of priests, the guardian of the holy and the widows, dressing the naked and feeding the hungry. And she was endowed with many other virtues resembling the first saints who followed Christ's call and apostolic preaching. So again, I want to remind that this is the view of a scribe, a low-ranking clergy, who describes the great lady of the household, and of course is presenting the view of that society. So this the beginning of this description is interesting because it gives us some information about the fashion choices of women at the time, of noble women, whereas the subsequent praise of her spiritual qualities reflect the clerics, or maybe even the entire society's expectations of the nobility in general. So I highlighted, as you could see, the characteristic features that this society wanted to promote or impose on women. And at the end of this characterization, you could also see some references to what these noble women were supposed to be doing, and what they were doing at the time. All these qualities are ascribed by the scribe, however, to both female and male members of Melchizedek's family, including her husband, her daughter Kata, and her son Chorduanel. So it's not like, on the one hand, it seems like it is something that only women were supposed to be doing, but with exactly the same words, the scribe describes also the male members. So I assume it's kind of reflects the general values of that society. So we are told that Melchizedek had several children in this colophon, of whom many passed away at a very young age. So, Gata is one of them to whom this entire gospel was dedicated. Now, giving birth to children appears to have been women's primary role in society, for we can see the same in the description of Kata's life, which seems to follow a pre-written scenario in which she has no or very little say. Kata is given into marriage to an influential landlord to forge a new alliance, or perhaps strengthen an existing one. And the scribe tells us that her wish was to have many children. She had already one child when she became pregnant again, this time with twins. It was during her second labor that she passed away. It should, however, be mentioned that Kata's brother, Chorduanel, also had little say in his marriage. The scribe tells us that, I quote, having held a council and wishing to increase the size of their clan, Melchizedek and Vigen's family marry him to the daughter of Vasil, the brother of the Armenian Catholicos, Lord Grigorios, that is Grigor III Pahlavuni, the mighty and the great, whose name was Vanine. So we could see that Kata's brother was also more or less in the same position, as a result of which, he had almost no say in who he was going to marry. Another interesting motive that can be discerned in the colophon is a repeated allusion to and citations from the Bible. When speaking about the motivation behind Melchizedek sponsoring the manuscript, the scribe draws parallels between her and the merchant from Matthew 13:45, who is in search of fine pearls. So as you could see, she went on a quest for this fine pearl that is the manuscript, which cannot be exchanged with anything existing. This is a common literary topos found in many manuscripts, and another example we shall see later on in this talk. Moreover, while describing Melekset and her relations with her husband, the scribe says, as Paul, the herald of Tarsus, the chosen vessel, the sermon of the universe, says in his teaching, wives, be subject to your husbands in everything as you are to the Lord. And husbands, love your wives as you do your own body. The allusion to Pauline teaching establishes a certain hierarchy. The wife should be subject to her husband, and the husband should love her as his own body. Considering the fact that Melekset was undoubtedly aware of the content of the colophon, this interpretation of familial bonds must have been the one promoted by the church and reinforced by the patriarchal institutions of Armenia at the time. Interestingly, I worked on this topic a lot, especially as far as the texts of the 5th century are concerned. And it's interesting to notice that in the 5th century, we don't have this sort of hierarchical division between men and women. And this is something that appears much later, especially after the Arab conquest. We find this sort of hierarchy pointed out in the text. And this is another fascinating topic for research, but that's for another time. So to summarize, the formulaic language of this particular colophon and a substantial number of biblical references portrays the world of the 12th century Melekset's family through the eyes of a male cleric, whose main aim is to glorify the family of the sponsor by highlighting their spiritual devoutness, especially in times of trouble. His representation of female figures allows us to catch a glimpse of women's lived reality and identify the expectations put on their shoulders by the society which had strong patriarchal values. Now, my next example is from a 14th century gospel kept in Matandaran, number 7651. It contains two colophons, one written after the completion of the manuscript, the primary colophon, and it was written by its owner Stepanos Sebastati in 1320, and the other one after the manuscript was purchased by a certain Baron Shah in 1387. The latter colophon, albeit short, contains compelling details about women's life in medieval Armenia. This additional colophon, as any other additional colophons, do not contain the glory part. They are usually omitted because they are added later on and there is not much space in the manuscript to write that. So it primarily focuses on the changes of circumstances related to manuscript's ownership, location, condition, and so on. This colophon informs us about the change of its owner, and we find out that Baron Shah purchased this manuscript with a substantial financial contribution of his wife, Jahan Melik. So, and as you could see, there are clear identifications of her contribution. So may you also remember my wife, Jahan Melik, along with her parents who longed for this priceless pearl. Once again, the reference to the priceless pearl of Matthew 13:45. This desirable manuscript, which is royal, the one that Jahan Melik, daughter of Lord Grigor, asked for and received it for her fairly earned assets, as she gave her Nashan 3,000 spitak and her Yerestes 3,000 spitak, and bought this in accordance with the command of the Savior, and so on. As with Melekset, the author of the colophon, who seems to be Baron Shah himself, makes an allusion to Matthew 35, as I said, and the pearl, and he calls the manuscript as royal, but this is not an exaggeration, as the original colophon mentions that the manuscript came from the royal scriptorium of Cilician Armenian kingdom. Now, What follows is a reference to some practices that involved women in medieval Armenia and in this particular society from which these people come from. So we clearly understand that it is Jahan Melik who contributed the money to buy this manuscript. The scribe mentions that the money came from her fairly earned assets. This is also a standard expression. You have to earn the money in a fair way so that you can sponsor a sacred text. In this particular case, it is a reference to her Nishan and her Yerestes. It's very difficult to translate these words into English, so I kept the original Armenian word there, but I will try to explain this. So the word Nishan refers to the money that Jahan Melik received during her engagement as a gift, while Yerestes was a ceremony preceding the engagement, during which the future groom and his family would pay money to see the bride's face before the marriage. And 3,000 spitak, it's I don't know how the rates were at the time and the inflation, but by comparing to some other manuscripts, I could say that that was a substantial sum of money, because in one case, a part of the church collapsed, and the entire village gathered 3,500 spitak to rebuild it. So I assume it's a very substantial money for the time. Now, two more observations can be made from this account. First, it is evident that all the money and apparently all the gifts given to the bride-to-be were considered her personal assets, and she could use them as she wished. Second, it provides insights into marriage practices in the late 14th century, which bore striking resemblance to marriage practices observed in some Armenian communities in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I try to compare this and try to see whether we have similar things at a later time. And the ethnographic material especially is full of references to Yerestes and Nishan and similar practices at the time. So this account also implies that young girls of marriageable age covered their face not to be seen in public. Again, a practice which was attested at a later time, but interestingly, it is not attested in late antique Armenian sources. And my impression is that by looking at different sources, that everything depended on the geographic location. There are references to locations where women did not cover their faces, did not cover even their heads, and other places where they had to cover for some reason. Again, this is another very interesting topic for research to see whether the geographic area in which these people lived affected somehow the way women had to dress and their social role in society, their position in society. Now, the title of Baron Shah, that is Baron, was a loan word from French, used to denote a nobleman, a landlord, or an important person. Jahan Melik's father, Grigor, is presented as a ter, lord, which also shows a relatively high status in society. Thus, we can safely assume that the practice to which the colophon refers were observed amongst the upper class society. But it is not clear in which, as I said, geographic location it is, because unfortunately we don't have a specific mention of the place where Baron Shah and his wife Jahan Melik lived. My next example is a jashot, a missal from the 15th century, again kept in Matandaran. It was, the colophon was written by the hand of a woman called Gariane. The language of the colophon contains several forms of spoken language and is stylistically different from that of the main colophon of the scribe. It is written in the first person and shows a very good level of literacy. So I provide the Armenian text here, and I've highlighted the forms which started to appear slowly, like the ku form in medieval Armenian texts, but it wasn't the standard classical Grapar Armenian language. And also some spellings here, like with the word hanteknesti or Kadafkan, which you would expect to be written the first one like handegnesti and the other one as Gadafkan. So this also shows some sort of either a dialectal form or a form, the way she pronounced these words, this is why she wrote this. But other than that, we could see a really good level of literacy because the rest of it is written in very good classical Armenian. So I believe that this indicates that Gariane received some sort of education and she was familiar also with the convention of the genre, even though the details about her identity preserved in the two colophons reveal no association with a clerical class. So the scribal colophon asked readers to pray for Gariane and her husband Smeon, who departed to Christ, as well as their parents, her father Shahergan, her mother and her children, Hayots and Ustiane, and her son Melike, as well as her son Johannes, who departed to God, and her nephew, sister's son, the Mahtesi Sarkis, together with all their blood relatives. These details about Gariane and her family do not allow us to identify the social class to which she belongs. Only the nephew's title, Mahtesi or Mahtesi, which was used in relation to anyone who had been on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, shows strong religious devotion of that member of the extended family. Scribes usually mentioned people's titles, especially if they were honorary or showed the person's status in the community. The absence of titles allows us to assume that Gariane had a relatively humble background, which makes her being literate a very compelling fact that might indicate women's access to education. But again, this needs more evidence and more investigation. In her colophon, Gariane informs the readers that she purchased and donated the manuscript to the Church of the Holy Mother of God in the village of Haidar, which was in Erzurum province, as a memorial to her husband and her beloved ones. She puts a strongly worded curse on anyone, even her children and relatives, if they dare remove it from the church or damage it. This is another compelling issue which I am addressing in my forthcoming book. The separate section, as I said, is dedicated to curses, and this particular one is really very interesting. And this one is quite unusual because it says that if any of my children or relatives dares either to sell or to pawn or to cut a page of this book, may Christ God cut them from within and put that part next to the unbelievers. I guess because I haven't come across a similar curse in any of the colophons, I believe this was something that they used in their daily life, and she kind of felt compelled to put it in her colophon to protect this very precious manuscript. Gariane also gives instructions to the clergy who were to handle the manuscript. And may the priests or deacons or servants of the church who will come across this book take care of it by not keeping it uncovered and by not putting it uncovered on a stone. May they be blessed by Christ, and may the priest Johannes be the guardian and the person in charge of the book. The tone of this colophon is very authoritative, pointing at an influential woman who had the means to buy the missal and to donate it to the church. My next example is the Echmiadzin Gospel, number 22, that was copied in the 15th century. It was sponsored by Halim Khatun, in memory of her deceased sons and husband, whom she lost one by one within an unspecified period of time. The colophon was written in 1485 in Argeș, on the northern shores of Lake Van, by Hovhannes Mangasarians, who provided us with some details about Halim Khatun's life. So Halim Khatun is described as a pitiable and humble, literally as like a lamb. One of her sons, Johannes, is referred to as Hoja, a title used in Armenian for merchants. From the description of how Halim Khatun's children were killed, we can assume that they were all doing some type of business. And for that reason, they traveled to large metropolises of the time, such as Sultania and Isfahan. This colophon attests to a family with many children. But as you could see, unlike Melekset's family in the Sassoun Gospel, in the first example that I brought, they did not die of natural causes, but were murdered at a young age by the bandits. The tragic loss of Halim Khatun's children and husband is presented in the following way. Okay, I don't have it on the slide, but I'll read this out. So she purchased this opulent treasure, this divinely worded holy gospel, in memory of herself and her children. The handsome and graceful young man Karapet, who departed joyfully to the city of Sultania, and on his way back home, he was delivered into the hands of bloodthirsty, ruthless Tajiks, reference to the Muslim population of the area, who martyred him for no reason with a sword and dagger. Likewise, his brother, Hoja Johannes, was murdered by the sword, also at a young age, in Isfahan, at the hands of unrighteous bandits. As well as her other young son, Ezdan Bakhshin, who also at a young age traveled to the east on business. And they returned with joy, and upon reaching Tabriz, he suffered the pain of death and departed to God. In this case, we don't know what happened to him. And then we have the tragic loss of the husband, of her husband, and the father of these children. And their pitiable father, Grigor, with broken heart and bitter life, went to Isfahan for his son, Johannes. And on his way back, with heavy sighs, disconsolately passed away in Sultania. Thus, we learn about the history of an Armenian family who lived under Muslim rule in an area which at the time was divided among a variety of Turkic and Kurdish chieftains. Halim Khatun does not accompany her husband to retrieve the bodies of their children, which is understandable, I guess, considering how volatile the region was. Instead, we are told how she copes with the loss of her beloved ones. This pitiable woman, Halim Khatun, having witnessed the indescribable anguish, having spent days in tears and not having lost the light from God, purchased this holy gospel of the Lord in memory of herself and her parents Stepanos and Nazmelek, as well as of her husband Martyros and Grigor, and her living son Johannes, and her brother Gorg, and daughter Gulbash, and all her blood relatives. So we can see that the sponsorship of the manuscript serves as a means to overcome grief and to do a pious deed, which may be beneficial both for the sponsor and her beloved ones in terms of spiritual salvation. In order to be eligible for salvation, Halim Khatun must have paid for the manuscript herself, although that's not mentioned in the colophon. And my final example is from this book of sermon, the Karos Girk by Grigor Tatevatsi. It was copied in Jura in Nakhichevan province, and it has preserved the memory of an Armenian woman scribe and perhaps an illuminator whose name was Maryam, We find several other women scribes and illuminators of manuscripts in later centuries, but Maryam so far appears to be the first one about whom some evidence has survived. The main colophon of the manuscript and several other pages, most likely illuminated ones, were ripped off, and now nearly half of the 977 pages manuscript has survived. So just half of it. Fortunately, Maryam left several other brief commemorative notes in different parts of the manuscript, which shed some light on the provenance of the manuscript and on the person who copied it. A short commemorative note on page 723 contains only the remember part. I call them pages because this is how it is described in an article by Yeremian, who was an ethnographer, and he doesn't use the term. So I am not sure whether it was recto or verso, on which part of the page it was. So I'm using his pages. So as you could see, the remember part, remember Christ God, the useless scribe Maryam the confessor, as well as my parents, both spiritual and biological, and all my benefactors. And may you also be remembered in Christ our God. And his is the glory forever. Amen. The reference to spiritual parents implies Maryam's association with a church or a monastic establishment. As women's monastic centers were virtually non-existent in Armenia, especially in the region where Maryam lived and worked, we may assume that she refers to a male monastic establishment. What was her relationship with the clergy? How old she was when she worked on the manuscript? And many other similar questions remain unanswered, as they might have been included in the lost colophon. Maryam also refers to herself as me, who is guilty of multiple sins, called Maryam, but only in name and not in substance. The scribe, the useless Maryam, a lost soul Maryam covered in sins, the lover of the word, and the useless scribe Maryam the confessor. And these are scattered throughout the manuscript, throughout the parts of the manuscript that survived. These characterizations are quite common in colophons, and they confirm Maryam being the copier of the text. Yeremian used the last characterizations to claim that Maryam was also the illuminator of the manuscript. She uses the word getzor, getzoras Maryam in the original, which, however, is a conjecture on Yeremian's part, as the word literally means someone who draws lines. However, in scholarly works, the word getzor is commonly understood to refer to a scribe and not the illuminator. The illuminator, as we saw in the example, one of the examples I showed, is mostly tzachkoch, so the one who illuminates, who makes it look beautiful, but not getzor. In the absence of any other evidence, it is impossible to give a definite answer to whether Maryam indeed illuminated the manuscript herself, or as it was more common, it was done by someone else. Whichever the reality, by looking at some parts of the text that you could see on your screen and copies of the illuminations reproduced by Yeremian in his article, it is easy to assert that Maryam was a well-educated scribe, and whoever did the illuminations was a talented illuminator. And here you could see some more ornaments appearing on the margins, usually, of the manuscript. Now, one final note. As you might have noticed, many women and men mentioned in today's talk have names that have foreign origin, mainly coming from Arabic or Turkic. This is a very interesting phenomenon that puzzled many scholars working on Armenian history. Thus, the prominent Armenian linguist and philologist Zakarian, in his Dictionary of the Armenian Personal Names, writes, It's a strange fact, of course, that the Armenians, even during the brightest years of Christianity, adopted personal names of their religiously hostile nations, such as the ones of the Arabs and Turkic peoples. I do not know how one should explain this phenomenon. Social scientists have tried to provide a variety of explanations of this phenomena, but they mainly have linked it to practical considerations. Thus, adopting a foreign name allows one, according to Justina Ching, I quote, to enhance their better intercultural communication, to receive some form of privilege, for example, religious or political, or to create better chances for trade and business, not to mention the political or colonial influence. End of quote. This seems to be a reasonable explanation for the Armenian context too. For the Armenian people, even when having an independent state, had to negotiate their rights with the colonial powers to ensure their existence in this very volatile region throughout the Middle Ages. In conclusion, I hope that these sample colophons, albeit different in content, size, place, and time of productions, demonstrated how valuable they are as primary sources for the study of women's history and gender relations in medieval Armenia and Armenian communities in different parts of the world. The colophon of the Gospel of Sassoun, for instance, a eulogy to Queen Melekset and her daughter Gata, sheds light on the traditional roles of medieval noble women in Armenian society, and which offers an interesting insight into the values held in this society. The colophons also testify to women having the means to sponsor expensive manuscripts, and thus being able to participate in the acts of commemoration and fulfilling an important social and religious duty of interceding for the dead. Of course, we also know a lot of examples of women sponsoring and building churches and monasteries alongside this evidence. This is well demonstrated in the Gospel manuscript acquired with Jahan Melik's personal assets, which she received before her marriage from her future husband's family. The tragic loss of one's children is another common motive that we saw in these examples. Finally, the colophon of the Book of Sermons, the Karosgir Bargrikor Tatevatsi, allowed us to identify a female scribe, Maryam, and perhaps also an illuminator, and preserve her memory for the future generations. The examination of these colophons has revealed their value for the study of women's history and gender relations in medieval Armenia, but also showed various limitations of this literary genre. The formulaic language and the brevity of the colophons, the different geographic locations where they were written, the circumstances under which they were written, and many other factors do not allow us to write a complete history of women by using these valuable primary sources. Instead, each colophon should be treated as a unique testimony and studied as such in the first place, and be studied as such in the first place. Only when we examine all the colophons like this, we will be able to identify common patterns and motives and better understand women's life in medieval Armenia. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Zakarian, for presenting a very judicious selection of vignettes that Armenian colophons afford, illustrating aspects of the conditions, life experience, and agency of various categories of women associated with the medieval scribal practice. I'm sure it has stimulated many questions among our audience, which we will return to in a few minutes. But first, allow me to introduce our discussant, Dr. Rosie Vartyter Aroush, who will share her comments and insight on the paper. Dr. Aroush received her PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA, with an emphasis in Armenian studies and a concentration in gender and sexuality studies. She is currently expanding her dissertation into a book manuscript to be published by Routledge. Her research investigates the experiences of LGBTQ Armenians living in the diaspora with a focus on identity, family, and community. As a pioneer in bridging the fields of LGBTQ studies and Armenology, Dr. Aroush's book eliminates the current gap and promotes the growing body of knowledge in gender and sexuality studies by inscribing Armenians into that domain, while marking the introduction of LGBTQ research into the interdisciplinary field of Armenian studies. In addition, Dr. Aroush is the co-founder of Vlyum, the largest digital library of Armenian ebooks and audiobooks, seeking to make Armenian literature accessible to as wide an audience as possible worldwide. Dr. Aroush, thank you for agreeing to be our discussant. We look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Professor Cowie, for the introduction. And thank you, David, for this wonderful presentation. I will now share some of my thoughts and curiosities for our discussion today. I think a fascinating point to start with is women's relationship with education. For example, in the case of Zakarian, there are a number of unusual factors. First, her relatively humbler background. Second, her access to education. What do we know about women and education during this period? And how do these colophons fit into that history? Especially when looking at the case of Maryam, a well-educated scribe and perhaps even an illuminator. How unique or common was Maryam's situation? These colophons were written to honor and preserve legacies of those who had passed, and in return served as coping mechanisms when dealing with grief, a common practice with works of art and projects still present today. As David explained, it was a trend to mention children that had passed away. The reason being for the reader to commemorate and say a prayer for the soul of the deceased children with the hope of easing their situation in the afterlife. Additionally, the mention of the children shows the success of how many births a woman was capable of, and thereby proving that they were able to have children. Though this may not have been a motive, it did save women the shame associated with being barren. Getting a glimpse into women's history through these colophons reiterates the patriarchal institutions, and in the case for marriage, not surprisingly indicates that they were set up to forge alliances for both men and women. Yet there was a vast difference in their roles within the marriage, with wives expected to obey their husbands. Where for the men, the position is to respect women as they would their own bodies, for women, the instructions are with no regard to the self, and they are expected to be subject to their husbands. However, it is interesting that when women had money or gifts, it was considered their own personal assets and they had the freedom to spend it as they wished, as in the case with Jahan Melik. Was this unique to her case, or was it a privilege available to other women as well? Regarding issues of equality associated with inheritance, what were the nuances between male and female heirs? And what role did women having some sort of financial independence play in the marriage? You already touched on this observation I had made, David. For the young women who had to cover their faces not to be seen in public, was this a formality specifically and solely for the occasion where the future groom would pay to see the bride's face? If this phenomenon was more widespread, what does that tell us about the restrictions women had in medieval Armenia, both in terms of clothing and in life? And David mentioned that in later centuries, we find several other women scribes and illuminators of manuscripts. How significant was this number? Were they a small minority then too? The selection of colophons we've seen today are of those cases that provide the most information on women. Presumably, in most examples, they provide only meager indications of family connections, either to the male patron or the male scribe. How representative are those colophons as a whole? In reviewing David's discoveries with these colophons, we get a glimpse into the daily lives of women from primary sources and sometimes from the women themselves. Though on the whole, in these colophons, the detailed information largely treats the elite upper classes. And so how far can we expect that this genre will significantly expand our understanding of women's social situation? Perhaps it is safer to say that we are getting an understanding of women's history of those in the upper classes. In furthering this research, it would be beneficial to contextualize the data from colophons with other documentary evidence, such as medieval martyr texts, perhaps, to get an understanding of the full picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aroush, for your wide-ranging and probing analysis of Dr. Zakarian's presentation. Now, before we turn the paper over to the general Q&A, which will be monitored by Professor Karagosian and myself, I'd like to give Dr. Zakarian the opportunity to react to some of the queries just raised on the role of colophons as a conduit for the elucidation of women's role and status in medieval Armenian society. Dr. Zakarian.
Thank you very much, Rosie, for this wonderful summary and the questions that you raised related to colophons as sources for women's history. In fact, these are some of the questions that I asked myself while doing this research: how far we could go, how much we could learn about education, about the role of women in that society. There are certain things that we can be sure of. So in most cases, when we have a scribe writing and describing the society where he lives, sometimes it's the monastery, sometimes it's the wider area. We know that they were in most cases very low-ranking clerics, and they had connections to the society itself. They had family there about whom they write. So it's not only about the upper class that we learn, but we also learn about the lower class. So this is another unique aspect of the colophons. So it's not like the privileged that get access to these colophons to get their name inscribed in a colophon, but also very humble and simple people. And in those cases, we for example, there are colophons which mention women that worked in they did some work in a monastery, like cleaning up or cooking. So even that layer is present there. So there are many examples, and I believe these need to be studied on their own first, as a text on their own, to try and understand what is the scribe trying to do within the context of that particular monastery and geographic area. And as you mentioned, then we can expand it and try to compare with other sources, with other texts. Unfortunately, we don't have especially for the 15th century, we have, I guess, 14th, 15th century, we have only one substantial historiographical text, like Tovma Metzobetsi's history, and the rest is something much smaller. But we have other narratives. And after studying the colophons and the representation of women in them as a separate text, and then trying to expand, that would be perhaps methodologically the most reasonable thing to do. But there is a lot to look for, and I'm sure that I managed to show that there is a wealth of material to be researched, and I hope this will kind of inspire some sort of development into different aspects of women's representations.
So now we open the paper to general Q&A, and perhaps I might begin, if I may, David, by raising a question with regard to your first example, Queen Melikset. Yeah, I think that it's quite fascinating that from this relatively late date with regard to Sassoun, we have a colophon with such detail that this one provides. And you investigated different aspects of this appellation of Takuhi. The first one, of course, the most obvious, is connected then with royalty. And I wanted to raise this question with you to get your input on that. So as you know, there is a very close relationship between the family in Sassoun and, of course, the Ardrunis in Vaspuragan. And it's very clear that in this case, Melikset is a product of this process of intermarriage. At an earlier point, particularly then in the development of Sassoun, we see that it's an area which is very much in the sphere of the Mamigonians. And therefore, of course, there is this reference in the colophon to her ancestor being Varta. Now, I think that this is very striking because fundamentally this would mean that on both sides, she has royal blood. The Mamikonians in the late 4th century, of course, married into the Arsacids, and the Arjunis from 908 raised the level then of their region to that of a royal throne as well. And I think one of the points that is very important to consider here also is that the significance of royalty that seems to have remained for many centuries in the Arjuni clan. So it's true, of course, as you mentioned, that fundamentally their status as regal comes to an end in roughly 1021, when they moved to take up territory near Sebastia. But I think it's very significant that earlier on in the 12th century, we have, the family actually enters into ecclesiastical schism in order to maintain this sense then of separateness, distinctiveness that they have in creating a Catholicate. So the sense is very much what they couldn't achieve for a very long period then in the secular realm, they are seeking to recreate in the ecclesiastical. And one of the points which I think is very important here is that in a whole series of colophons associated with that Catholicate, they mention that this is takavoragan, yev katholikosagan. So it's royal and catholicosal. So bearing that in mind, I wanted to get your feedback on whether, in fact, your first selection may, in fact, be the most plausible, the most convincing in this particular case, that granted the significance then of this royal lineage, it is celebrated at any point possible. So obviously in her case, but not then in that of her husband. So how would you react to this perspective?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right that it's even 100 years later, after the kingdom itself was not powerful anymore, they still had this self-identification, a part of their identity. They kept this concept of royalty in it, and they wanted to reinforce it in any avenue that they could find. And this is exactly what is happening here. Indeed, they still believe that they are, of course, of royal origin, royal blood. And as far as the word itself is concerned, so with the Arsacids, we had the title of Tikin, that meant the queen, that was used, or Bambishan, but that was mainly used for Persian queens. But for the Armenian Arsacid queens, it was the title of Tikin, the great lady, the lady of the household, of the family. And in the Arsacid case, the most important woman in there. And then slowly we see that this title changes its meaning because of the absence of a kingdom. And I do believe that later on we actually get this, the word takavor is used more often, and that word takwi as well. So they kept this title, the Artsunis kept this title exactly for that purpose, to show that continuity. And of course, the reference to Vartan Mamikonian is linked to his martyrdom, and again, the religious affiliation and the faith that the family bears. So trying to basically put them very high and praise them. And I'm sure that the sponsor herself, Melik, said she definitely knew about the content of this colophon. And it was the manuscript itself was kept in the church where Gata was in the area where Gata herself lived with her husband. So, and when she was buried as well, it was kept there as a memorial for her. So it is a statement of status and a statement of the identity that they carried on even after the loss of and abolition of their kingdom.
Indeed. And of course, I just recall that this is so powerful with them that, as I'm sure you recall, in the 15th century, for all of 8 years, on the island of Akhtamar, they do, of course, crown one of their own, the nephew of one of those Catholicoi, as king of Armenia for all of 8 years and controlling the domain of this small island. Exactly. It's very powerful. One other question that I had relates, so you had just mentioned the situation of Vartan as being a martyr. One point that attracted my attention with regard to Maryam, in addition to some of those other qualities that you alluded to, is the fact that she refers to herself as being a confessor, so presumably Kostvanor. So I'm very curious, is there any information in the manuscript about what entitles her to that sort of designation, which would imply that she had undergone a certain amount of persecution for her faith?
Well, unfortunately, as I said, half of the manuscript is missing. So, and especially the final part of it, where normally you would have the primary colophon with all these details that we needed. And so whatever we have are just these snippets of information found in the marginalia or inserted in the text, as it often happens in some parts where there is space. Then the scribe would normally include a commemorative note asking for readers to pray for the family, for her, and so on. So we don't have any other information, unfortunately, about that. But considering the area where she was writing, it could be the case that she had to undergo through some sort of difficult situations to try and preserve her faith and confess her faith. Yeah, but that's another very interesting characterization. Yeah.
Any other questions? I believe Professor Karagosyan, I think.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you, David, for a fascinating talk, and Rosie for your comments. So David, this question is for you, but it kind of touches on something that Rosie mentioned. How common was it for Armenian women, or men for that matter, but especially women, to have been literate during the Middle Ages? And related to that, were the female sponsors of the manuscripts you cited clearly able to read and write and actually read the scripture that was, being created and illuminated, or was there a reliance on clergy? Perhaps you could talk about that.
From the 5th century, we know there is clear evidence of women being literate, especially in the noble households, because they had priests coming to teach and help women with the education of the youngsters. So the younger generation was receiving the initial education in the households. And then after that, depending on whether they wanted to pursue a religious career in the church, they would go and continue in the monastic schools and develop it. But they would definitely receive some sort of education. For example, with the Shushanik Vartan Mamikonian's daughter, and in her martyrdom, we read that she could read, she prayed, and she was teaching her children also to read. So in the noble household, and I repeat, this is evidence from the 5th century, this existed. And I don't think it's changed much later on. So we know of monastic schools that we had, and especially in the medieval period, we have already what we may call universities, like centers, monastic centers, where a very good education, religious education, was provided. And this was open to men only, because these monastic institutions were monasteries for men only. So we have this evidence of monastic schools, and we have the evidence that the nobility received some education. And we have evidence from Cilician period as well, that the kings and the princes could read and write, and they signed documents and so on. So, and I believe that this was happening in their households, again, through the clergy, the clergy would provide basic education, and then women would also receive it. It is very difficult to say anything about women of lower class. That's a bit more difficult because we don't have any evidence regarding it. And on top of this, I would also say we have the merchant class developing very quickly in the Middle Ages. And then we know this, the fascinating story researched by Sepu Aslanyan a lot about the nodes, the travel routes in which Armenians were involved. And we could also see that you need to have some sort of education there. You can't do business without having this education, and not only education in Armenian, but also in other languages. You need to be able to communicate. So I do believe that in general, that class as well received education, and women were also involved in it. So regarding these two classes, the upper class and the merchant class, I do believe they had education. For the lower classes, it's a moot area, so we don't know much about that, unfortunately.
Thank you. Peter, did you have another question that you'd like?
Yes, I did actually. So basically picking up on what David just mentioned with regard to the middle class. I think that your last two examples are very significant in that regard. So these centers of Argesh on Lake Van, and then of course Jura, Julfa on the Arax in the 15th century. And so I think these are excellent examples of the role of middle-class women and the means that they had to become involved in purchasing and becoming patrons of manuscripts. And I think that what's also very interesting with regard to the colophon of one of them is these references. So Tabriz, Isfahan, Sultaniya. Clearly, of course, we see here the significance then of these trade routes. And I think that what is fascinating is that we see largely then from these examples, the importance of the route east at this point, from Lake Van to these centers largely in the northwest of Iran. And I think that we can parallel this from a whole series of other materials from this period, that this is extremely vibrant in terms of exchanges of different kinds of commodities in the cultural realm as well. I was very curious. So when would you argue that we see the beginning of this process? So where the middle class basically tries on the approach, the status of the aristocracy for size in terms then of becoming the patron of manuscript production?
I believe that this starts quite early. As soon as they acquire means, they realize that, or they are taught, they are told that this is one of the ways to achieve salvation. And this is a common theme, as I mentioned, a common theme that we find in the colophons. People really believed that by sponsoring a manuscript and by asking people to read their names during the prayers, mentioning them in a context of the church or the monastery, would enable them to achieve this salvation. So as soon as people started getting this idea that, okay, I can do something for myself and save my soul and help my family to get salvation, they would go into every length just to achieve that. And we have from, I would say, one of the first examples that I remember reading is from the 13th century. There are references of commoners who would sell their only cow just to sponsor a manuscript. So this is part of their mentality that developed quite early on in the Middle Ages, and this continues. So you didn't have to be very rich or belong to the upper class to sponsor that sort of manuscript. So they would go, they would do a lot of things, just selling whatever they had just to sponsor a manuscript. because of that belief that this will help me to reach salvation and go to the heaven. So yeah, it's really fascinating. They couldn't build monasteries. They didn't have the means to do so. But it was more feasible that they could do it with a manuscript, a relatively smaller thing. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why we have so many gospel manuscripts, because that survived. Of course, there are other reasons as well, but the gospel was kind of the most important text, the religious text that someone would like to sponsor. And that's why we have almost half, if I'm not mistaken, of manuscripts that survived, Armenian manuscripts that survived, our Gospels.
Yeah, that's also true very much also with regard to the Psalter. Again, of course, very practical work in terms then of the Armenian liturgics, and indeed also then a significant part of the of Holy Scripture. Yeah, indeed.
And another example is the Haismavurk, because Haismavurk was a text that was read in the church on specific days commemorating the saints of that who was celebrated on that particular day. And then very often at the end of the commemoration, you may find a reference again to people like the scribe, his family, or the sponsor and his family, and saying, as soon as you now pray for this saint, also alongside with this person, or with the intercession of that saint, please pray for the salvation of these particular people. And Haismavurk was another very common text sponsored, because that was read on a daily basis in the church, and which meant that their name would be heard in the church every day, and thus would have more chances of reaching God.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions that can be posed. One from the audience: did other types of manuscripts, such as medical documents, also have colophons? Is there much evidence of women's involvement in the health or medical type of manuscripts or documents?
Starting from the 10th century, colophon writing became a kind of genre. The structure that I showed is something that we already see consistently from the 10th century onwards present there, which meant that any manuscript that was copied contained a colophon, and including the medical ones and any other manuscript. The only issue is that whether they survived or not. So there are many manuscripts, because usually the colophon was written on the last pages. It might have been damaged, or it went missing. That sort of things would very often happen. And we have thousands of manuscripts which do not have a colophon, and we could just identify their origin from the script and other internal evidence that we have. To be honest, I haven't studied that part as far as women are concerned in medical manuscripts, and it would be fascinating to see. I'm sure that you could find evidence of women there. There are a few volumes that were published first in the Soviet Union by the Armenian Academy of Sciences, the collection of colophons by Levon Khachikian. That's a very valuable source to check and see whether the medical ones also contain women's names. I think we find at a later period, there are a few studies by Tamar Minasyan, for example, about different schools of different scriptoria, where she mentions women involved in production of manuscripts. So that's but she mainly focused on later 16th, 17th century and onwards. So we do have a lot of material there, and it is worth really checking and finding. And we, fortunately, we have also the sources available, so you don't have to, it's not necessary to go and consult the manuscript because of that fantastic job done by Khachikian and others, and Artashes Minasyan, Matevosyan, and so it is worth checking, and I'm sure you'll find many interesting and fascinating stories about women.
Thank you. And just one more quick question that I see. You had referenced the gender hierarchy that is found in the book of Ephesians, and that was mentioned in, or highlighted, let's say, in one of the manuscripts you found. Did that hierarchy or the relationship between men and women and that emphasis change over time between the earlier manuscripts and later manuscripts, or it just depended on what was documented?
That's a wonderful question. I started working on this issue, on the representation of women in Armenian sources, focusing on the 5th century, like the beginning, the so-called golden age of Armenian literature, because that's the start. And I wanted to see how women are presented in those texts. So, and if you look at this text, so the findings are in that monograph that Professor Cowie mentioned. So I looked at all the instances where women are mentioned and described. And my conclusion was that as compared to the Greek and Syriac authors, because they influenced the initial Armenian literature very much. The Armenians were translating the sacred texts and everything else from Greek and Syriac, and also translating the works of the church fathers. And if you compare what the Greek and Syriac church fathers write about women, it's a lot, the hierarchical division is clearly stated in those texts. But when I compared it to the Armenian authors, you could see that they do not put any stress on that hierarchy. They completely ignore that hierarchical thing. And my understanding is that in the 5th century, this is not the case. In the 5th century, the Armenians are still in the mindset of their previous religion. Despite the fact that for 100 years, the Armenians were Christians, in that period, in the 5th century, they still had, and this was the reason why the letters were invented, to be able to translate the sacred text and to promote Christianity further, because it was a difficult process. People didn't want to convert, despite what Agathangelos says, that in hundreds and thousands people were converted, but there was a need to create the alphabet to promote this Christian religion. And so the mindset of people was still the pre-Christian religion, the Zoroastrian religion, in which gender is not an important factor. So it doesn't matter whether you are men or women. In Zoroastrianism, the key, of course, kind of simplifying this, but the key idea was whether you belonged, whether you supported the powers of goodness or the powers of evil. So gender was not as important. And this was the result of my research, that in the 5th century, we still see the same mentality. However, if you look at later periods, this hierarchy slowly creeps into the text. And we clearly see that already in the Middle Ages, this references to the biblical text in which women are considered as secondary, as less important. They unfortunately start to appear gradually, and then they become kind of the mainstream understanding. But that was not the case, at least in the 5th century.
Very interesting. Thank you. Okay, Peter, did you have any other questions you wanted to pose?
No, I think I had all of mine answered very sufficiently already. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, well, let me then conclude our webinar once again by thanking Dr. David Zakarian for a very stimulating lecture, and to Dr. Rosie Aroush for a wonderful discussion. And again, to Professor Peter Cowie for coordinating this event. So this was a really fascinating discussion of your very important, impactful research, David, and we're grateful to you and to Rosie for taking the time to discuss it with us. And also allow me to thank most profoundly our very energetic Promise Armenian Institute Deputy Director, Hazmik Baghdasarian, who has been very active in all aspects of this event, and all other events, in fact, for our Promise Armenian Institute. And so let me close our webinar by announcing a number of upcoming Zoom or YouTube-based events that are hosted or co-sponsored by the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute. So in fact, tomorrow and the next day, Saturday, February 26 and Sunday, February 27, in the afternoon Pacific time, 1:30 p.m. Until about 6 p.m., there will be a hybrid conference that is partially in person, partially Zoom-based, that is hosted by the Ararat Museum, entitled 1860 Gesaria, that is Kayseri, to Los Angeles 2022, Mapping Culture and Sharing Stories. And then on Tuesday, March 8 at 7 p.m., we will have a discussion pertaining to the subject of the stateless diplomat, the life and heroic activities of the well-known diplomat during and after the Armenian genocide, Diana Apkar. There will be a discussion on a film that will be available to our viewers, and a discussion on her life with a well-known scholar who is based in Japan. So see our Promise Armenian Institute website for information on this upcoming event and all other events that we are planning for the Promise Armenian Institute. So once again, thank you for your attendance at this webinar, and we look forward to having you participate in future events.